We have more stories like that, so awesome. Can't wait to hear what you're going to be doing over there. So
I'll let you know.
awesome. Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about chapter 18, I believe. We're going to be going over HTTP and forms in the context of the browser and JavaScript. So again, if you guys want to follow along, the presentation is on Slack. Otherwise, I'll try to make it to where you guys can read it on screen. Chapter 18. Okay, how many of you guys are familiar with the protocol? The web protocol. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Vest. Okay, so when visiting a website, the browser looks up the address of the server associated with the input that you're giving it. So when you go into the browser, you type in google.com, right? It tries to open up a TCP connection. How many of you guys have heard TCP before? Okay, so I'll give you the fancy definition that's on notes here. I did not memorize this, okay? So it says, the Transmission Control Protocol is one of the main protocols of the Internet Protocol Suite. It originated in the initial network implementation in which it complemented the IP, which is Internet Protocol, right? So therefore, the entire suite is commonly referred to as this TCP/IP, okay? That's what you guys most likely look at when you guys come across it. It'll be TCP/IP, okay? So it provides a reliable, ordered, and error-checked delivery of a stream of bytes between applications running on hosts communicating by an IP network. So we all know how the internet works, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay, we all work on it, so hopefully we do.
Magic.
Magic, right?
Yeah.
It's not C#, so perfect. Okay, so the default port is port 80. A lot of you guys working with Node, for example, see that that's the port you normally work with, right? Unless you're working with a secure connection, it's port 43. So, okay, so this is a default port for HTTP traffic. Okay, so if the server exists and it accepts the connection, the browser sends a response, not a response, but a request, like this. Have you guys ever opened up your browser console and looked at the headers, for example? We will in a couple of minutes, but just take a look at this and you'll see, we'll try to get familiar with this. So the information is sent by the client is called the request, right? And it starts with this line right here, okay. And again, you guys don't have to memorize all this, we're just exposing you to this, right? Because eventually you will see it and you will come across it. Okay, so the server then responds to the same connection with something like this. Okay, so it sends you the version of HTTP that's on the browser. In one of the past talks, we talked about HTTP 1 and HTTP 2, which is the new version. Okay, it also gives you the status code and in English what it means, right? Now, you guys see where it says, no mouse, okay. You guys see this right here? That's your response payload, okay? That response, that's what gets translated to your DOM. That's your website, okay? That gets sent in the response. Okay, so the request method, and I know you guys have heard these before. There's get. The get method requests representation of the specified resource. Requests using get should only retrieve data, right? There's post. The post method is used to submit an entity to the specified resource, often causing a change in state or side effects on the server. Okay, how many of you guys are familiar with both of these? Okay, perfect. Or at least have seen them in some context. Okay. There's also these, delete. The delete method deletes the specified resource, okay? Now, these don't work unless you have access to them, right? So in your requests, you pass in headers as well, okay? Now, we're not gonna talk about implementation right now, but more about the content.
What's a request payload?
I'm sorry?
What's a request payload?
The payload? So when I said payload, I said response payload. So the response that it sends a bunch of bytes back, right? All the information that it sends back, okay? So we have put. The put method replaces all current representations of the target resource with the request payload.
What does that mean in practical sense?
So you're either sending data or receiving data, right? So when we did the request, we sent this header right here.
On a website, I'm assuming this is on a website, right?
Yeah,
So if you use a put, what would it do if you put something?
So it depends on the content you're doing it, right? Because there's different ways that you can do that. You can either send a request to the server, have it do all the logic there, and it'll do it from there, or you can make it to where you're accessing an API, for example, right? So it really depends how you're implementing
It says it replaces everything on put, that's why we put it.
it. Okay, so think about.
It
I think that-
replaces the current representations of the target resource. What does that mean? What does it do?
Have you used put before in the context of the CRUD, for
I've
example?
never used delete or put.
Okay.
It's more a convention than anything else. So when you're working with a web page direct, you're almost always doing get and post.
Yeah.
Usually get.
I'm familiar with get.
When you're
Post.
working with REST and APIs over the web, you're usually following this by convention. But you could actually, if you really wanted to, you could use a delete to create a resource. It's convention that you limit it. And so typically, get is read, post is write, delete is delete, and put is update.
I think the closest that I could compare put to would be like update.
Yeah.
Basically, when you write a page, it's already done, but you want to add something else, or you change something in that page, it's you use put.
Exactly.
Yeah, see, because in my experience, it's like he was saying, I normally use get or post, right? And then all the logic is done wherever I'm doing the logic, but they're there for your use, so I don't know. But thank you. Okay, server responses. How many of you guys? No, all of you guys should be familiar with this.
Yeah.
The service response will start with a version, followed by the status of the response. First as a 3-digit status code, and then as a human readable string. Okay, so you guys have seen 200, the 404, 500 is the worst you can get, the server error. So let's see right here, we have an example right here. That first one right here, what's the status code for that one? 304, okay? That one, when you see that, it's not modified. If you hover over the 304 in your console, in the DevTools, it'll show you something readable, and it'll say not modified, okay?
There's a whole Wikipedia page that has all of these different
Yeah.
status codes, and when you're working on a REST API in particular, you're just living in that page
Yeah.
the whole time. You've been done with.
So status codes. Status codes starting with so you could either use this or the page we'll talk about. Status codes starting with a 2 indicate that the request succeeded. Code starting with 4 mean that there's something wrong with the request. And again, 404 is probably the most famous code that you've seen. It means that the resource cannot be found, right? Have you guys ever made a special page for a 404?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So codes that start with 5, I want to say 500, mean an error happened on the server and the request is not to blame. Okay, so it's not a problem with what the request that you sent, but the server, right? So, one second. So headers. Again, how many of you guys have worked with headers before? Okay, so a couple of you. So let's see. Let's try this. One second, guys. Okay. You guys can see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, can you guys see where it says headers?
How did you pull that up?
Oh, there we go. I was trying to unzoom. I normally do it with my mouse. I'm like, I can't figure this out. Okay, so I brought up the DevTools on Chrome, and then I clicked on Network. I refreshed so that it can load all the resources that it's using, and then I clicked on one of these resources, right? So each one of these resources can be an image, a CSS file, a JavaScript file, whatever that website's loading that it's going to be using, right? So in order to load any of those resources, a request was sent, right? So a request was sent, it was accepted, something was sent back, right? So we have headers, okay? We have response headers, and we have request headers, okay? You guys can go in here and take a look at the method that you used to get that information. So for example, for this file right here, it was a GET request, right? We can see the status code that we just talked about, 200, okay? The remote address, information like from the response, when that resource expires, the date, the content type, so it's an image. Looking at the extension, it's a .webp. I didn't know what that was, but now we do. It says an image. This is a different image format. Okay, any questions about this? Okay, so we all know that it's just headers, right? Information sent back
Why?
or sent in a request. Ask it, Scott, ask it.
No, I'm just trying to find that in my console on Chrome, and I don't.
Yeah, so if you do like Control-Shift-I, and then you click on network, refresh the page.
Yeah, I opened that, I clicked network.
Control-Shift-I or Control-Shift-J?
Are you on the Mac?
Depends what you have your hot
Yeah.
key set up.
And then if you
I don't
click
have-
one of the resources, click on it, and it'll load that panel.
And then that's where the headers all.
Yeah, you can click on headers or anything else.
Got it.
We have a question from Facebook
Cool.
from Eric
Yeah.
Sandoval. How important is it to protect headers?
So, you don't want to expose information you're not supposed to, right? I've seen a lot of websites where they put what server they're using, like they're utilizing Nginx or Apache. I mean, if it's something that you need to expose, do it, but only expose the things that you really need for the application to function, right? For example, one of the biggest issues that I see with people working with WordPress is they expose the PHP version that they're using, and say you're using 5.4 for some reason, right? Now you're letting everyone know, hey, you can attack me and do whatever you want with me, right? So I would say only expose what you need to expose. So don't just expose everything.
Obviously, the header here is not the same as the header in the DOM for your HTML.
No. That's completely different, yes.
I think that might have been something that was
Yeah.
confused too.
So what Scott just said, he said, are the headers that we're talking about right now the same as the header on the DOM? No, it's not the same. This is for the request and response sent from the server to the client.
Has nothing to do with the web page itself.
Not with the DOM itself, no.
I mean, with the writing of the web page.
Right.
You can look them up and show and look at them in JavaScript, even in the client side, but they're not. You're looking up meta information.
Yeah,
about
well, I'm
the
saying
page.
this is server information and protocol information, has nothing to do with the web page itself.
Well, it actually goes back and forth with request and response. We can look it up.
With that section in the HTML document, it's a header though, it has nothing to do with that.
It's not that head.
Exactly.
Right.
But it is. There are APIs in JavaScript to look up that information when a data looks.
Yeah.
Cool. So any other questions about this? Oh, perfect.
Also, another question from Eric Sandoval. How would you protect them?
How would you like?
Protect the headers?
So, for example, there's what is it? Allow. We have a.
I can help if you want.
Okay, perfect. Because we do have a slide, but I'm trying to remember because I wrote. I'm like, hey.
Yeah. So
allow
it
origin-
turns out whenever you're using any kind of web server, it has a configuration file, and you can go into the configuration file and turn on and off headers you do or don't want the server to display as it goes.
Yeah.
Typically, the response code and the request URI and content length are almost always shown, and you can't really do much to stop it. But things like server,
Yeah.
which is what you were talking about, you can turn that off in the web server.
Perfect. Any other questions? No. We were on the roll. Okay, good. Thank you. Let me go back. Okay.
What is
Okay, so the next slide, browsers and HTTP. As we saw in the example, browser will make a request when we enter a URL into the address bar, and then the resulting HTML page references other files, such as images, JavaScript files, and all of those are retrieved, right? As you guys saw in the console, when you click on any of those, you can get all the information for each one, right?
Get the shadow and reflect light back on the character.
Okay. A moderately complicated website can easily include anywhere from 10 to 200 resources. Okay, think about a website like Facebook, for example, or whatever. They have hundreds of images, right? Each one is a resource. So to be able to fetch those quickly, browsers will make several GET requests simultaneously, rather than waiting for the responses one at a time. Okay. Fetch. How many of you guys have used Fetch in JavaScript? Okay, perfect. So the Fetch API, those of you guys that have used are familiar with it, but it provides a JavaScript interface for accessing and manipulating parts of the HTTP pipeline, such as requests and responses. It also provides a global fetch method that provides an easy and logical way to fetch resources asynchronously across the network. Okay, you guys all know that it's promise-based. Okay, we won't go into detail as we did have a talk about fetch, so hopefully you guys were here. And again, all these presentations are on Slack as well. So, how many of you guys are familiar with HTTP sandboxing? Perfect. He's our friend over there. Oh, it's faster. So browsers protect us by disallowing scripts to make HTTP requests to other domains. To access domains for legitimate reasons, servers can include a header explicitly to indicate to the browser that it is okay for the request to come from another or specific domain. Okay. How many? I think everyone's had an issue with course, right? Okay.
Is that hot linking?
Hot linking?
Where you have
I don't know if it would
where
include
you're
hot
basically
linking.
displaying an image displayed on a different site on your web page.
I think that's a specific parameter, right, that you can modify on the server.
So ultimately what you're messing with here is something that says only accept resource links from the server itself that I'm serving. Now you can
Yeah.
proxy things through, that's how all the AdWords stuff works. But ultimately you're saying don't load an image from malware.com hacking JPEG kind of thing. It's something that limits it, it's something that was put in place probably the last 5 or 6 years, I want to say. It's not that old. And it's because of all the hacking that's been done on
I
websites.
remember back in the day, what a lot of homebrew coders would do is they just, they'd use links to these image sites without actually hosting the image on their own site, so that they didn't have to pay the bandwidth costs.
Yeah.
And that was a huge issue with a lot of these bigger sites that were just getting really pissed off at these small websites that had all these hot links.
Yeah, and you can do that with content distribution network, CDNs, but I think that is something you actually set up on your server to let everything happen, it just handles it. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but I know that CDNs are very popular now for exactly that reason. You get a bunch of sites around the country that serve the same exact content, and if somebody in New York is requesting your site, they might have to come out all the way out to your California server to get the HTML, but all the images are loaded on a local site in New York. That's the CDN.
So we have one about security and HTTPS. So data traveling over the internet tends to follow a long, dangerous road. To get to its destination, it must hop through anything from coffee shop Wi-Fi hotspots to networks controlled by various companies and states. Right? So at any point along its route, it may be inspected or even modified. Right? How many of you guys are familiar with HTTPS? Okay, that's where the web should be moving, and I think it's moving along. Google has a whole effort for that, and it's had for the last couple of years. So to secure the HTTP protocol used for URLs starting with HTTPS, it wraps the HTTP traffic in a way that makes it harder to read and tamper with. Okay, before exchanging data, the client verifies that the server is who it claims to be by asking it to prove that it has a cryptographic certificate. Okay. Now, that certificate, it has to be from an authority that's recognized by browsers. Okay, it can't just be you gave yourself a certificate, right? For development purposes, you can fake them, but they don't work in production. So, let's see. When it works right, HTTPS prevents other people from impersonating the website that you are trying to talk to and from snooping on your communication. It's not perfect, and there have been various incidents where HTTPS failed because of forged or stolen certificates and broken software. But it's a lot safer than normal HTTP, right? And those of you guys that create your own websites and put them up into production, you guys should be familiar with CertBot, for example, on a server. Do you know the name of the company that gives out those free
Yes,
SSL?
yep, Let's Encrypt.
Let's
So-
Encrypt.
Let's Encrypt.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Let's
Thank you.
Encrypt's fantastic. Google's been promoting it, but Let's Encrypt is basically a conglomeration of a bunch of companies that put a pool of money together so that anybody that develops a website can get a free auto-renewing certificate. And that used to run some cash, and that's actually free now. You can set up the whole thing to automatically do it. It's really nice.
Yeah, some hosting companies even went to the length of making it to where you just click a couple buttons and it does it for you. So it's
And be
nice.
careful, speaking of hosting companies, because now if you buy a host, I wouldn't say all of them, but a lot of them will try to sell you, getting an SSH key, so you can get it for free, don't pay somebody for that.
How long have you been able to get it for free?
Well, my wife Jackie here did a project back in 2017, and it auto-renews every 3 months. We've had no problem with it.
So
It's very powerful.
we don't cover the nuances as far as SSL certificates, but there are some benefits in the different kinds of SSL certificates that you can get. But for example, if you take a look at something like PayPal, right? You can notice on the address bar that it has like a green text and it has like a little icon, right? So you don't get that with a normal like Let's Encrypt certificate, but it is still more secure than just normal HTTP. So question?
Yeah, another question from Eric Sandoval. Does it matter if a site is only HTTP if there's no information being entered, or are you still at risk?
So I think it depends, right? If the website's going to be doing any sort of SEO, it's in their best interest to do it, right? There's no reason not to, right? You can get it for free now. So unless there's a reason you wouldn't, I would say just go for it. Again, unless it's something no, I'd say go for it. Just add it. So.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Do it for any reason, mostly because Google won't even show your results on the first page
Right,
unless you're
they send you the
HTTPS.
security page,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not
And
just Chrome that does that either.
It's very true. And you do open yourself up to vulnerability. So if you're running a browser for any reason that's vulnerable, you are open to
And there's really no reason not to, right?
Yeah,
It's
I
not
can't say
difficult to do.
Especially now that they're free, so.
Oh, yeah.
So forms were originally designed for the pre-JavaScript web to allow websites to send user-submitted information in an HTTP request. Okay? This design assumes that interaction with the server always happens by navigating to a new page. Okay? If you guys notice when you submit a form, it tries to reload or go somewhere, right? Okay, so we'll talk about that. So forms as a whole. When a field is contained in a form element, its DOM element will have a form property linking back to the form's DOM element. The form element in turn has a property called elements that contain an array-like collection of all the fields inside it. Okay? Here's an example. So we have this form right here that has an input of name, an input for the password, and then a button, right? When you click on the button, assume that it submits the form. Okay? The name input has a name attribute of name, and then the password input has an attribute of name set to password. Okay? So right here, we're doing document, and we're selecting that that form, right? So document.query selector, we look at the body, and then we look for form, right? And then once we find it, we use the property elements, and it spits out all the input items, all the children, right? The field items. So input, button, right? Does that make sense? Okay, a web form. It consists of any number of input fields grouped in a form tag. HTML allows several different styles of fields, ranging from simple on and off checkboxes to drop-down menus and fields for text input. Right? This is not an HTML talk, but here's a list of different field types. A lot of field types use the input tag. This tag's type attribute is used to select the field style. These are some commonly used input types. So there's text, there's password, checkbox, radio, and file, right? Again, this is not a full list, just an example of a couple. The nice thing, for example, is if you're using input and say you put in type number, it changes the style of that input to where you can increment, right? Do something called step, for example. It'll increment it. You can also set attributes to limit the number that you're inputting into that input. you can make it to where it has a minimum and a max. So there's a lot of different things you can do with HTML itself, and then access all of that information through JavaScript, right? So some other form elements, form obviously defines an HTML form for user input. There's input, text area, and so on. Okay, those of you guys have created forms before or should be familiar with this, right?
It's just HTML tags.
I'm sorry.
They're just HTML tags.
Yes, tags. Mhm. Yeah. Any questions about this? So the name attribute. The name attribute of a form field determines the way its value will be identified when the form is submitted. It can also be used as a property name when accessing the form's elements property. Okay? So here's an example of using the name attribute to access something. So we do document.querySelector. And remember how we talked about how you can utilize pseudo selectors, for example, to select something on the DOM, utilizing querySelector, the method. Okay, so what we did is, name is an attribute that we put on the input for name and password. Okay, and the way that you access an attribute is you utilize the brackets, put the name of the attribute, and then, for example, we're looking for the name with the attribute called name that's set to password. Okay, we pass it in and it finds the first one. So it's spitting out this one right here. Okay, does that make sense? Okay.
C.
What's right here?
Yeah, you know what? I just realized the mouse. Thank you so much for letting me know. Okay, so this right here, document.querySelector, right? The name attribute is what we're looking for. Notice how it's within brackets, because we're looking for an attribute, right? We set it to password, because we're looking for the attribute that's set, that's name, but it's set to password. So it'll look through all of these, and it'll say, okay, I found the first one, here's the first one, it's this one. So it'll return this input, right? So we can see that it's returning this right here.
Does querySelector return a list?
Only the first one.
Oh.
Yeah, if you do querySelector all, it'll return a list of them. Yeah. Okay, does that make sense?
Another question from Eric. How would you go about form validation? For example, checking if required fields are filled out before submitting.
So you can use an attribute called required. Within the tag, you can place it like at the end. That's where I've seen it usually.
That just
That's
checks to
what's
see if it got
mentioned.
You can also, there's a couple
Isn't
other.
it? It's a switch in the tag, isn't it?
I've
Like
seen it
required
as
equals
required.
yes or something. Right?
You just put required in there. So you were saying?
There's a couple different ways you can do it for form validation. You can actually set it up so that the submit button, when you hit it, instead of sending it to the server, it calls a function. And that function can go through your list and say things like, okay, well, make sure this is a text field with text, make sure this is numeric, make sure this is something
Check the
selected in
text
this.
format.
Yeah.
So if you're asking for a phone number, you make sure it's an actual.
So sometimes when you hit a form, and then you see these little errors pop up next to the
And then
fields,
it's gonna
that's how they're doing
multiply
that.
this by 10 each
They're
time,
doing
so
that
it shifts
because
over.
you're submitting it to the function and it's turned
Right.
around and it's
So based on what he's saying, when you submit a form, there is an event that's fired called submit.
She talked about
Yeah, I'm talking to everyone. You're the one asking questions too.
No, that was Alex's
No. I'm looking at you.
You,
man.
So does that answer his question? Thank you for the question, Eric.
Dang, rude.
Okay, so submitting. A button with a type attribute of submit will, when pressed, cause the form to be submitted, obviously, right?
Right.
So pressing enter when the form field is focused has the same effect, okay? But the cool thing is when you do submit a form, an event is fired, right? The event's called submit. And you can do things like validation, extra steps of validation, or if you want, you could do even some cleanup there. But of course, you gotta do cleanup on server too. So, submitting a form normally means that the browser navigates to the page indicated by the form's action attribute using either GET or a POST request after a submit event is fired, right? So why would we intercept the submit event? Okay, we can write code to verify user input, or we can disable the regular way of submitting the form entirely. Okay, and have our program handle the input. So like he said, we can validate it. Possibly using fetch to send it to a server without reloading the page. Again, there's different ways you can do it. Okay. I keep looking at you like you just asked me a question, so it's fine.
Just something to add to that. So one thing you want to be careful with is when it comes to validation is don't just do it in JavaScript.
Yeah.
Any user can come in and turn off JavaScript in their browser and bypass all of that. So you always want to have your validation both client side and whenever you're working with a server.
Server. Yeah. How many of you guys work or have worked with PHP, for example? Wonderful. Let's not talk about it. It's okay. Us two people that have worked with PHP can talk later. Okay, so we have an example here. We have a foreign tag. We've set the action to a specific page, right? We have text right here, we have input. So when I press the button to submit, what do you think it's going to do? Should I zoom in?
Fire the submit event.
Okay.
Would you have a listener attached to?
If it's attached to the JavaScript, will run that function.
Which is console log, saving values, whatever. Let's spit that out.
Cool. That's all it's gonna do. No magic. Okay.
So let's say you go through that event. What happens if it doesn't get stopped? Let's say you're all valid. What happens after that? Because it seems like you're hitting the save button.
Yeah,
There's that function.
doesn't
What
actually
happens
do
after?
anything.
It doesn't
Just
go- it
console.
doesn't go anywhere.
Just the
Yeah, it's not
console
gonna
log.
go anywhere. It's not.
This is a test win. This is just a test out.
I'm saying if it were real.
functionality.
I'm saying if it were real, what would happen?
His result is there to show the console log.
Yep.
That's all it's gonna do. Yeah. But yeah, now you have that choice of where do you want to send that data, right? That you collect from the form itself. So-
And there's that thing that we learned last week or week before, the prevent default. You were telling us
Yeah.
about?
Yeah, so when an event is fired, you do get the event object, right? So we do events, which is the event object, and it can be event, it can be cookie, whatever you want to call it, right? And then we use the method prevent default, so we can stop the default action that it would do, which would reload the page and go somewhere, right? Does that make sense? Okay, now we're towards the end now. What we're gonna talk about now is pretty interesting. It deals with local storage and local sessions on the client, okay? When an application needs to remember something between sessions, you cannot use JavaScript bindings, right? Those are thrown away every time the page is closed. So when you close a page, reload it, whatever, all your variables are reset, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so you could set up a server, connect it to the internet, and have your application store something there, right? Or you could store data client side. Now, I don't mean store everything client side. I mean, think of a note-taking application, right? Something that doesn't have information that you need to secure. It's more like information that you need there for a little bit, right? So we will cover in chapter 20 how to do this whole section where you set up a server, set up an application store and everything, right? Utilizing Node. So, but yeah, for now, let's talk about the concept of saving data on the client side. So we have something called local storage. Any of you guys familiar with local storage? Okay, cool. So the local storage object can be used to store data in a way that survives page reloads. This object allows you to file string values under names. Okay, it's very.
Is that like a cookie?
No, it's a different API. You set up a key and then a value. So it's like you have an object that lives there even when you reload. So
You
What are
can
the
store
limitations on it?
images, you can store whatever. It's basically a limited amount
What
of
are the-
space on the user's
What
hard
is,
drive.
what are the limits on it?
So we'll talk about it in a minute. So here's an example
It's
of
something
utilizing
like
it.
the browsers.
So for example, we
Each
have
browser has its own local storage.
we have some
set up.
methods for local storage. So for example,
so
let's say we
in
want to add an
JavaScript,
item
if
to
you
local
have, like,
storage, right? We do
export
local
the file.
storage dot set
That's
item,
where it goes, is local
the
storage.
key that we want to use for that item that we're storing. So we're going to call it, for example, username, okay? And then the value that
It's
we're
done that
passing
way
it.
because they
I do not know how to say the
user
author's
username
name.
hard drive with JavaScript.
Margin.
It's like a layer to
Margin?
prevent, you know, hacking or phishing.
Yeah, let's leave it at that. Now that item is saved in the local storage, okay? Now if I do console log and then access it using local storage dot get item and then the key that I use to save it, it'll spit out the author's name, okay? To remove it, very straightforward. There's a method called remove item. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, now the
Does it
next.
have collision detection?
No.
No? What, so if you just try to store something else in the username, it overrides it?
It'll override it.
Ah.
Yeah. I
Only
mean,
from that
it's
site,
as
though.
smart as you,
Right.
right? Like,
Oh.
however you want to use it. Okay, calm down fast. I didn't mean you.
JavaScript.
But it'll only do it from that site.
Yeah.
He was about to get up and come over here and do something. Okay, so we have in the next panel, we do have a more to life example of how you would use it. So let's say for whatever reason, right, you want to save a list of, say, users, right? You have an array which it has a bunch of objects in there, okay? Now, you can't store objects or arrays or anything within local storage, okay? However, you can use something like JSON stringify, right? Do you guys know how that works? Yes, okay, perfect, wonderful. Okay, so we did local storage dot set items, we set the key to users. We did JSON dot stringify and we passed it in this array of users, right? Now, let's say I refresh the page. I come back and I say, hey, I wanna get that list of users I was working with, right? It can be users, it can be notes, whatever you were doing, right? So I set up a variable, whatever I wanna call it. So I set it to all users, and then I did JSON dot parse, okay? And then I used local storage dot get item, and I passed it in the key of users, okay? Now when I call all users, I'm gonna get an array of objects. Same as I had up here under const users, okay? Does that make sense?
Serialization, deserialization.
Cool. So a value in local storage sticks around until it's overwritten, okay? It is removed with remove item or the user clears the local data, okay? I'll give you guys a list of methods in a second. But first, sites from different domains get different storage compartments, okay? I mean, it makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
That means that data stored in local storage by a given website can, in principle, be read and overridden only by scripts on that same site. Okay, does that make sense?
It also sounds a lot like cookies.
Yeah.
Cookies are, but they're in a different storage area.
Yeah, but they're doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
basically.
think if you refresh your cache, like clear your cache, I think you clear your local storage too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you can set it manually to do all of that. So,
There's actually an option in Chrome that every time you shut it down to delete all cookies and clear all local storage.
isn't that what incognito does?
That's incognito, but you can actually set it in the basic
cool.
Chrome settings so that every time you close the browser, it deletes all your cookies and
How do I?
The browser or turn or shut off the computer?
the browser. Every time you exit the browser.
The browser.
Sounds terrible.
I was like, that sounds annoying.
Yeah.
You have to go in and set it. It's not the
Went
default.
somewhere.
Done that.
It's not the default setting, but it's in the security and privacy
Like, I don't know
settings in
anybody
Chrome.
would do that.
So which time when you wanna
I'm really paranoid.
enter your email, you will have username.
Everything, yeah.
And it's anytime you clear your cookies and
Yeah, no
stuff.
thanks.
So
Well,
anytime
it's
you
kinda
It just sounds like.
And that won't necessarily clear usernames and passwords. You can store it.
no, that's stored somewhere else too.
Yeah, that's why I said, I think you can set it granularly. You can set which things specifically you want them to not save, right? So,
But that's not stored in local storage either. The
yeah,
usernames
there's
and
different
passwords and
APIs,
stuff.
yeah. Okay, so the methods for local storage, right? And again, these will be pretty much the same for local session, I think it's called. We'll see it right now. So get item, straightforward, right? Get an item by the name or the key that you passed in as a string. Set item, add item by name and value, right? You pass it a key and then you pass the value. Remove item, removes an item with whatever key you passed in. Key retrieves a key at a past index in local storage. Okay, so local storage has a list of all items that you've saved. Okay, so if you pass in a key to the key method, it'll retrieve that list of items. Okay, and then you have clear, which clears all keys stored in a given storage object. Okay. Now browsers do enforce a limit on the size of the data a site can store in local storage. That restriction, along with the fact that filling up people's hard drives with junk is not really profitable, prevents the feature from eating up too much space. Okay. Do I know the specific limit for Chrome, for Firefox, or whatever? No.
You
It's
can
pretty
set it.
small.
You
Yeah.
You can set it, but the default is actually pretty small.
As it should be. I mean, if you're talking about one per domain, per whatever,
Mhm.
that.
It's
could fill in a big
megabytes,
chunk.
not even.
This local storage is hard drive, not memory?
Yes.
I believe
Yeah.
so.
It's
Yes,
hard drive.
just like cookies, it can persist between browser sessions, so if you quit the browser and come back in, it'll still be there.
Oh.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Huh.
Any questions from? Okay. So it's called session storage. Okay. Have you guys ever used session storage before? No? Oh, okay. So it works pretty much like local storage. There's another object similar to local storage called session storage. The difference between the two is that the content of session storage is forgotten at the end of each session. Okay? Which for most browser means whenever the browser is closed. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions? We have a lot more. Are we good? Okay. Any questions? Okay. No? Are we good?
Yay.
Vass, you have a question? That doesn't have to do with Blazor?
Nope.
Okay, perfect. Cool, so that's pretty much it. So, you guys don't have any questions? There's a bunch of pizza left, a bunch of drinks. You guys can stay around and oh, get up and say
Oh, well, I
something.
was waiting for you to get done.
No, you, come on.
Oh, I just.
Your ass up there, man.
Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, in addition to, the stuff, we wanted to further celebrate, oh my
They're awesome.
I feel like Robin has to stand up.
When the
I do.
further celebrate.
Sit on some kind of
So, we got you a cake.
Oh my God, you guys are awesome.
You're our first big success story, you know, like,
Yeah.
everything come together, networking works, right?
That's true, yeah. That's why I
Yeah.
wouldn't have without y'all, so.
The only thing is I totally botched it. I got the stuff to eat with, but I didn't get cut with, so we are gonna have to caveman
We
it.
should have something.
Just kinda like,
Yeah.
so yeah, well, I mean, whatever. you know,
Renaissance
we'll-
Festival thing.
We'll figure it out.
Oh, that's true.
But we're a room full of engineers. I'm pretty sure we can figure out how to get the cake, so.
There's gotta be a plastic something or other in here. Thank you, you guys rock.
Sweet.
Sounds like a happy